Hey guys, welcome back. We are continuing on with Chapter 3 of our text, The Deficit Myth by Dr. Stephanie Kelton. Hope you guys enjoyed the last one, and let's get back into it. So, Chapter 3 The National Debt That Isn't. Myth number 3 One way or another, we're all on the hook. Reality The national debt poses no financial burden whatsoever. When I arrived in Washington, D.C. in January 2015, I was the only staffer on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee who looked at the world through the lens of a currency issuer. I knew the federal government wasn't like a household or a private business. I knew Uncle Sam could never run out of money. I knew that inflation, rather than insolvency, was a relevant punishment for overspending. I also knew I was alone in this thinking. Everyone else fell into one of two camps. One, deficit hawks and deficit doves. The hawks were the hardliners, mainly but not exclusively Republicans, who looked at fiscal deficits as evidence of an epic mismanagement of our nation's finances. Budget should balance, period. Any imbalance between spending and taxation ruffled their feathers. They warned of a looming debt crisis and called for swift action to rein in fiscal deficits. The label was meant to symbolize their hawkish determination, at least rhetorically, to balance the budget and zero out the national debt. The honks taunted their opponents, the deficit doves, accusing them of being too sanguine or dovish about the threat posed by the nation's mounting debt. The hawks mostly blamed entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, while the doves pointed to tax cuts for the rich and trillion-dollar wars was the main drivers of government debt. While the Beltway, pundits and Washington insiders depicted them as polar opposites, I saw them as birds of a feather. Both considered the long-term fiscal outlook a problem that needed to be fixed. The main differences came down to disagreements about whether who and what had gotten us into this mess and how quickly we should act to repair the damage. Most Republicans wanted to slash entitlements, while most Democrats wanted to raise taxes, different paths to the same destination. By the time I joined the Budget Committee, I had established myself as a contrarian in this arena. As word spread that I could be heading to the nation's capital to advise the Democrats, journalists fired off articles with headlines like Sanders hires deficit owl. I had coined the term in 2010 as a way to distinguish the views held by MMT economists from those of the more deficit anxious birds. I decided the owl would make a good mascot for MMT because people associate owls with wisdom, and also because owls' ability to rotate their heads nearly 360 degrees would allow them to look at deficits from a different perspective. Most of the senators on the committee had never heard of MMT. Even the senator who hired me, Bernie Sanders, was initially surprised by the media attention surrounding his pick. When I met with the members of the committee for the first time, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine told me that he had read about my appointment in the Kansas City Star. No one was rude, but I could see that there was a reticence about expanding the deficit Avery. It wasn't easy being the new bird in town. I knew that my views differed sharply from theirs. The Democrats I was there to serve included a number of senators who had earned reputations as fiscal conservatives. Three of them had been anointed fiscal heroes, but the notorious debt-shaming front group fixed the deficit, fixed the debt. The job was frustrating in a lot of ways. On fiscal matters, I didn't share the views of the members. I was there to serve. I looked for ways to help the committee without reinforcing myths and misunderstandings about our nation's finances. I wrote carefully scripted talking points and drafted prepared remarks to be read aloud by the committee's ranking member. Sometimes, what you don't say is as important as what you do. So, I saw ways to reshape thinking in subtle ways, sometimes by pressing fellow staffers to strike a sentence or two from a press release or an op-ed. I was still an educator at heart, so I couldn't totally suppress the urge to introduce new ways of thinking. Besides, bad reasoning leads to bad policy, and bad policy affects all of us. One of the most eye-opening things I learned from a game I would play with members of the committee or their staffers. I did this dozens of times, and I always got the same incredible reaction. I'd start by asking them to imagine that they had discovered a magic wand with the power to eliminate the entire national debt. With one flick of the wrist, then I'd ask, would you wave the wand? Without hesitation, they all wanted the debt gone, after establishing an unflinching desire to wipe that state clean. I'd ask a seemingly different question. Suppose the wand had the power to rid the world of U.S. treasuries. Would you wave it? The question drew puzzled looks, furrowed brows, and pensive expressions. Eventually, everyone would decide against waving the wand. I found it fascinating. These people served on a committee that was literally created to deal with issues related to the federal budget, and not one of them seemed to catch up on the trick. They all had a love-hate relationship with the national debt. They loved U.S. treasuries as long as they thought of them as financial assets held by the private sector, but they hated the very same securities when they considered them obligations of the federal government. Unfortunately, you can't wave away the national debt without also eliminating the instrument that composes the national debt, U.S. treasuries. They are one and the same. Eventually, I'd point out that I'd asked two versions of the same question. It was like asking folks if they preferred the weather when it's 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius. That was sometimes awkward. Some of them told me they understood that waving the wand entailed eliminating the entire U.S. Treasury market, but they wanted the debt wipe to go out anyway because it scares voters. It's 0 trillion big. Of course, voters are terrified. How could they not be? Unless you're managed to steer clear of all political discourse. It's virtually impossible to get through the work week without encountering some form of hysteria over fiscal deficits and the national debt. Newspaper headlines stream of record indebtedness and looming disaster. A debt clock towers over pedestrians on West 43rd Street in New York City. Delivering the daunting numbers in real time, political cartoonists depict the federal budget as a hungry T-Rex eating its way through city streets or as an ever-expanding balloon on the verge of exploding. Bookstores are replete with bombastic titles featuring anxiety-inspiring words like endgame, red ink, and fiscal therapy. Social media circulates breaking news alerts to report the latest dire projections from the Congressional Budget Office. Talk radio plays alarming audio of former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, warning that, quote, our rising deficit levels pose a national security threat. Even ordinary citizens, like the one who put the sticker of a broke Uncle Sam on the bumper of the SUV, have become messengers of doom. It's a wonder what all hold up in a bunker. Bracing for Armageddon, the end is always near. The truth is, we're fine. The debt clock on West 43rd Street simply displays a historical record of how many dollars the federal government has added to the people's pockets without taxing them away. Those dollars are being saved in the form of U.S. treasuries. If you're lucky enough to own some, congratulations. They're part of your wealth, while others may refer to it as a debt clock. It's really a U.S. dollar savings clock, but you won't hear that from anyone in Congress. You can imagine why. Think about what would happen if a member of Congress returned to his or her district and tried to convince a room full of panicked constituents that everything they deeply fear about our ballooning national debt is really a big nothing burger. With every other voice of authority delivering exactly this opposite message, the words of the soothsayer would go over like a wind balloon. Sometimes, as Mark Twain put it, quote, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. Even if their own thinking wasn't so broken. There are reasons why members of Congress might not want the rest of us to see the so-called debt for what it really is. Nothing more than those yellow interest-bearing dollars called U.S. treasuries that we talked about in Chapter 1. For some politicians, attaching the word debt to a really big number creates the perfect foil. Meganophobia, the fear of large numbers, might not be a medically recognized anxiety disorder, but plenty of politicians seem to think it's real enough. I remember being struck by this during a meeting with members of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, had just released its 2015 to 2025 budget outlook, and the senators were poring over the report's findings. The CBO had projected that the fiscal debt deficit would stand at $1.1 trillion, and the gross federal debt would reach $27.3 trillion in 2025. The committee's chairman, Mike Enzi, found the number startling, but not startling enough. He was worried that by using decimal points instead of commas, the report would fail to stoke the right emotional response from our citizenry. To dramatize the numbers, he suggested the CBO be required to write the numbers out in long form: 1.1 trillion and 27.3 trillion. Recall that Senator Enzi ran a shoe sale business before getting involved in politics. As a businessman, he must have understood the importance of a good marketing campaign, a more comfortable fit, a wider selection, a more fashionable design. Finding the right message to appeal to shoppers is critical for sustaining your customer base. Tap into the right emotions. A good marketing campaign will bring people in off the streets. If you think about it, Enzi was basically looking for a way to market information about the government's finances in a way that would elicit a certain emotional reaction from voters. Once politicians like Senator Enzi succeeded in making us so anxious about the sheer size of their thing was labeled debt, they could weaponize that fear in a number of ways. By persuading voters that something must be done about these big, scary numbers, politicians can push for cuts to popular programs like Social Security and Medicare. Winning support for an agenda that calls for painful cuts requires sustaining public outrage over national finances. These are programs that benefit enormous constituencies. People will fight tooth and nail to protect them, unless, of course, they can be convinced that there is no alternative, that we must act to, quote, fix the debt, before it's too late. MMT shows that we don't need to fix the debt. We don't need to fix our thinking. Not just to prevent senseless cuts to programs that support tens of millions of Americans, but also have to have a more enlightened debate about the full range of things we could accomplish if you weren't so afraid. The debt isn't the reason we can't have nice things. Our broken thinking is. To fix our broken thinking, we need to overcome more than just an aversion to big numbers. With the word debt attached, we need to beat back every destructive myth that hobbles overthinking. China, Greece, and Bernie Madoff. I doubt the woman who placed a bumper sticker on her SUV was simply nervous about the size of the U.S. Treasury market. That is, the national debt. Chances are she had other concerns. Maybe she'd heard presidential candidate Barack Obama complain that the U.S. was borrowing from China and, quote, driving up our national debt that we are going to have to pay off. The debt clock on West 43rd Street doesn't just provide a real-time record of the outstanding total, it also divides that total by the size of the U.S. population. Calculating, quote, your share of the national debt. Maybe she was a mother who carried around a sense of guilt because she heard Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan that we need to do with the debt to, quote, protect our children and grandchildren from a crushing burden of debt and taxes. Or perhaps she was thinking about our nation going broke. We all know what happened to Greece. Maybe she feared for our great nation. After all, Obama had described the national debt as, quote, irresponsible and, quote, unpatriotic. I'm a mother and a patriot, and none of these things worry me. That's because I'm also an MMT economist who looks at all of this through a fundamentally different lens. I can read that latest CBL score report and not panic over the projected increase in the national debt. I don't agonize over, quote, my share of the national debt, and I never worry about the U.S. ending up like Greece. I don't fret over the possibility that China might one day shut off the spigot and starve the U.S. of the dollars we need to pay our bills. Heck, I don't even think we should be referring to the sale of U.S. treasuries as borrowing, or labeling the securities themselves as the national debt. It just confuses the issue and causes people unnecessary grief. Even worse, misguided fears stand in the way of a better public policy, and that hurts all of us. So let's try to fix our thinking. It was at a campaign stop in Fargo, North Dakota, where Obama told a small crowd that America was relying on, quote, a credit card from the Bank of China. His choice of words was important because it taps into two of our basic anxieties. For one thing, there's the fear of relying on borrowed money to pay the bills. We know from personal experience that taking out too much debt can cause financial disaster and distress. Borrowing to buy a home, a car, or even groceries puts you on the hook for future payments. Before long, the house payments, car loan, or credit card bill will arrive and you'll need to come up with the money to pay back the loan. Hearing that our country is running up trillions of dollars in credit card debt is enough to make everyone worry. Learning that we know that money to a foreign nation, an adversary even, only heightens the anxiety. It's not that we don't have anything to worry about when it comes to our international trading partners, as we'll discover later in Chapter 5. Quote, winning at trade. There are legitimate reasons for concern, but relying on China to pay our bills isn't one of them. To see why, let's take a step back and think about China and other foreign countries end up holding U.S. government bonds in the first place. Where did China get the 1.11 trillion in U.S. treasuries it held as of May 2019? Did Uncle Sam travel to Beijing, Star Spangled Banner, hat in hand, to ask the Chinese government for a loan? Not at all. What happens first is that China decides it wants to sell off what it produces to buyers outside China, including the United States. The U.S. does that too, but America exports less than it imports from other countries. In 2018, the U.S. exported $120 billion in U.S. manufactured goods to China, while China shipped $540 billion of its products to the U.S. The difference gave China a $420 billion trade surplus. The U.S. carries the opposite, a $420 billion trade deficit with China. Americans paid for those goods with U.S. dollars, and those payments were credited to China Bank's account at the Federal Reserve. Like any other holder of U.S. dollars, China has an option to sit on those dollars or use them to buy something else. Uncle Sam doesn't pay interest on the dollars China keeps in its checking account at the Fed. So China usually prefers to move them into what is effectively a savings account at the Fed. It does this by purchasing U.S. treasuries, quote, borrowing from China. It involves nothing more than an accounting adjustment, whereby the Federal Reserve subtracts numbers from China's reserve account, checking, and adds numbers to its securities account, savings. It's still just sitting on its US dollars, but now China is holding up yellow dollars instead of green dollars. To pay back China, the Fed simply reverses the accounting entries, marking down the number in its securities account and marking up the number in its reserves account. It's all accomplished using nothing more than a keyboard at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. What Obama was missing is the fact that the dollars don't originate from China. They're coming from the United States. We're not really buying from China, so much as we're supplying China with dollars and then allowing those dollars to be transformed into U.S. Treasury security. The problem, really, is with the words we use to describe what's actually happening. There is no national credit card, and terms like borrowing are misleading. So is labeling those securities the national debt. There is no real debt obligation. As Warren Mosler likes to put it, quote, the only thing we owe China is a bank statement. You could argue that this is actually a bad deal for China. In other countries, that trade surpluses against the United States. After all, it means their workers are using their time and energy to produce real goods and services that China doesn't hold on to for its own people. By running trade surpluses, China is essentially allowing the U.S. to take its stuff in exchange for an accounting entry that says we're keeping track of how much of its output we took. But we'll see in Chapter 5, China benefits from trade with the U.S. in a number of ways. Although China is the largest foreign holder of U.S. treasuries, it owns less than 7% of the publicly held total at the time of this writing. Still, some people worry that this gives China enormous leverage over the U.S. because China could decide to sell all its holdings, driving the price of U.S. market bonds down and the yield on those bonds, i.e., interest rates, up. The worry is that Uncle Sam could lose access to affordable financing if China refuses to keep buying treasuries. There are a number of problems with this thinking. For one thing, China can't avoid holding dollars assets without wiping out its trade surplus with the United States. That's not something China wants to do, since shrinking its exports to the US would tend to slow its economic growth. Assuming it wants to keep its trade surplus intact, it's going to end up holding dollar assets. As financial commentator and former investment banker Edward Harrison put it, quote, the only question for China is which dollar assets, green dollars or yellow dollars, it will buy, not whether it will go on a US dollar strike. And if it does decide to hold fewer US treasuries, yellow dollars, in its portfolio, this situation won't leave Uncle Sam strapped for cash. Remember, the US is a currency issuer, which means it can never run out of dollars. Moreover, as Mark Chandler, popular television commentator and author of the book Making Sense of the Dollar, observed China reduce its holdings of US treasuries by 15% from June 2016 through November 2016, and the 10-year treasury pay yield, quote, was virtually unchanged. Even though it can't happen to the United States, is it possible for a country to lose access to affordable financing? That's what happened to Greece in 2010. But that's because Greece undermined its monetary sovereignty by betting the drachma, in favor of the euro in 2001. Adopting the euro changed everything. All of the Greek government's existing debt was redenominated into euro, a currency that the Greek could not issue. From that point on, anyone who bought bonds from the Greek government were taking on a new kind of risky default risk. Lending to Greek was now a lot like lending to an individual U.S. state, say Georgia or Illinois. As we learned in Chapter 1, individual states are currency users, not issuers, that really are dependent on tax revenue and borrowing to pay the bills. Sure, they can still sell bonds to raise money, but financial markets normally demand a premium for the added risk of lending to someone who might not be able to repay. It's a lesson Greece learned the hard way, along with Ireland, Portugal, Italy, and Spain. As the 2008 financial crisis spread throughout Europe, the Greek economy suffered a severe economic downturn. Jobs began disappearing at breakneck speed, and tax revenues fell off a cliff. At the same time, the Greek government was making larger payments to support the ailing economy. That combination of forces, collapsing tax revenue and rising spending, pushed Greece's budget deficit to more than 15% of its GDP in 2009. Under the rules that established the euro, member governments were supposed to prevent budget deficits from rising in excess of 3% of their country's gross domestic product, GDP. But the downturn was so severe that it pushed the Greek budget deficit well above the 3% limit. 3%. To cover those deficits, Greek had to borrow. The problem is that under the euro, the Greek government no longer had a national central bank that could act on its behalf by clearing all of its payments. To finance its spending, the government really did need to, quote, find the money ahead of time. The TABS model doesn't apply to a currency issuing government like the United States, but it does apply to a country like Greece, which turned itself into a currency user when it severed the link between the central bank and the Greek parliament. The problem, as Greece quickly discovered, was that lenders weren't willing to buy Greek government bonds unless they got a substantial premium for the obvious risk they were taking in lending billions of euros to a currency user who might have trouble paying it back. From 2009 to 2012, the interest rate on the 10-year Greek government bond rose from less than 6% to more than 35%. Compare that with what happened in currency issuing countries like the US or the UK, where fiscal deficits were more than tripled from 2007 to 2009. By 2009, both countries saw deficits rocket from less than 3% to around 10% of GDP. And over the same period, the average interest rate on 10-year government bonds fell from 3.3% to 1.8% in the United States, from 5% to 3.6% in the United Kingdom. That's because both countries have a central bank that acts on behalf of the governments as a monopoly supplier of the currency. That backstop reassures investors who understands that the central bank has ironclad control over its short-term interest rate, along with substantial influence over rates on longer-dated securities. Greece gave up that backstop when it adopted the euro. It could literally run out of money, and everyone knew it. That's why it couldn't keep the bond vigilantes at bay. The term bond vigilantes refers to the power of financial markets for or more accurately, investors in financial markets to force sharp movements in the price of a financial asset like government bonds so that the interest rate swings unexpectedly. Ultimately, the European Central Bank did keep the vigilantes at bay, but not without helping to impose painful austerity onto the Greek people. By 2010, many European countries, including Greece, were ensnared in a full blown debt crisis. Credit rating agencies like Fitch Group, Moody's, and Standard and Poor's downgraded Greek government bonds, and borrowing costs spiraled out of control. As the crisis deepened, the Greek government came to close to defaulting on its debt. American politicians saw the crisis engulfing parts of the Eurozone and began urging Congress to act to reduce deficits here at home. Warning that a Greek style debt crisis could soon visit America. Savvy investors like Warren Buffett, billionaire inventor and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, knew better. As Buffett explained that the U.S., quote, the U.S. cannot, quote, have a debt crisis of any kind as long as we keep issuing our notes in our own currency. Buffett also understood that the Greek debt crisis happened because, quote, Greece lost the power to print their money. If they could print drachmas, they would have other problems, but they would not have a debt problem, end quote. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and stop it here for today. I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you liked it. I do enjoy the book so far. There's a lot of great material talking about, not just the U.S. economy, but foreign economies as well, and how they reacted to different recessions and economic financial instability, and even foreign trade influence. And that's just a big deal that even I myself am not well versed in. But it gives you some insight into what actually happens, how these bonds are issued, who pays them back, what countries like the United States can just issue money like it's no tomorrow, and who is just a currency user who has to borrow the money but can't just print their own. So it's pretty unique actually, and it's something to take consideration the next time you hear politicians say we're out of money or we can't afford this or the debt matters when it doesn't. So, but then I hope you guys had a great day. I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you for watching and see you next time.